program called Leading in Remote Teams. I think the fact is the situation right now with the pandemic has in fact forced so many of us to work virtually. I know some of us have been doing that for a long time, as is evident on the poll results, where about 20% of you have been working in remote teams for 10 years or more, but the majority of you, more than half of you, have been in it for less than 6 months. So unless you're in the front line or an essential worker, you will actually not be interacting in the workplace. And obviously we give our thanks to all the people who are in the front line and providing essential services. But the rest of us, we're having to make it up as we go, aren't we? We're having to kind of look at how do we actually navigate this new world of work. So my name is Tom Verghese. Welcome. I'm going to be your facilitator for today. I have been an independent consultant for the last 30 years. I speak, I write, and I coach in the areas of diversity and inclusion, cultural intelligence, and global leadership. So it definitely is a pleasure for me to have you here in the webinar, and we are doing this as a way of adding value to our clients. Last month we did a webinar on national cultures, which is how do you lead in times of uncertainty. Our focus this month is obviously on organizational culture, and next month our webinar is going to be on personal culture, self-care. So let me share my screen with you. Great. I want to tell you a quick story. I'm coming to you from Melbourne in Australia, where today it's kind of overcast, and we are coming, obviously this is the autumn. And in Melbourne, during the winter, football or Australian rules is a really very strong sporting code here. Pretty much most people follow the football, and it's a great topic of conversation. And I'm not a great football fan, but I know enough to have a short conversation around it. It tends to add to the small talk. So I had a meeting with a client. It was a banking client. It was actually on a Monday morning. It was for 9 a.m. I went in and we spent the first few minutes as usual talking small talk. How was the weekend? And we started talking about the football because she's a great football fan, talked about her team, etc. And then I posed a question to her, and I said, well, before we get into the meeting, I'm curious, do you, when you talk to your team in Bangalore, India, do you talk to them in the same way? Do you ask them about the weekend, what they did, etc.? And she paused, and she said, actually, no, I don't. Because by the time I speak to them, it is usually 1 o'clock in the afternoon for me, and I am in full flight for the day, right? I've already started, I'm going, I'm running with the day, so I tend not to do the small talk and check in with people. So what's the point of the story? The point of the story is to get you to understand and appreciate that when we are working with people who are co-located, when they are remote, when we are not seeing them face to face, sometimes we forget those niceties that are actually very important in terms of building teams. Because really, if you look at all teams, trust is the glue that holds high-performing teams together. So what we would like to do in this segment, really, is look at how do we enable us, how do we as a team, as a group of people, how do you lead, coach, and influence more effectively in remote teams? Now, I'm not talking here about leadership as in a title, because some of you will be actually in teams, but you can actually influence teams. So some of you will be leading teams, others will be part of teams. But ultimately, it's how do we make our teams more effective? Because if our teams are effective, then of course that's going to help all of us. And now more than any is a time where we really need good leadership. So where are we headed to today? We're going to be talking about context setting. I'm going to set that up very shortly, which is what I'm doing now. I want to touch on culture and complexity. I'm going to share with you 4 pillars to help run or manage or lead remote teams. And then I would like to have a short discussion on how does it in fact apply to your own scenario. And of course, we will have time for questions and answers. I'm happy for you to put the questions into chat, and then we'll take the questions from there. I have my colleagues, Phoebe, who works with me, and also Alekia on the call, and they will be looking at the chat box as we go. Because of course, you know, I would find that hard to do, to actually run the presentation and look at the chat at the same time. After all, I'm a mere male, so forgive me for that.
On that note, Tom, could I just interrupt you and request that you use the slideshow? We're getting presenter view at this moment.
Oh, okay. So what do I need to do? So it must have been because... Thank you, Phoebe. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe, for that. See, as you can see, folks, I always need help from my team because, you know, that's what makes us stronger, right? Working with each other. So what are some guidelines for you? 3 kind of key things I think that will be useful for you to think about. One is participate actively. So the question I'd like you to be thinking about is, what do you need from this webinar? You're obviously giving an hour of your time. Time is a valuable resource. What is it you need to take out of this which will help you be more effective in your own teams working remotely, but also how can you share the learning with others? How do you develop the mindset of a learner, which is really having a curiosity? And finally, how do you be accountable for how you are during the time here? Now, we make no apologies for this, that in this webinar, we are looking at this webinar through the lens of culture. Okay, because that's my bias, that's the area that I work in. So we're not looking at it from technology or finance or structure or systems, but more around culture. I mentioned this to you earlier on in my first book, In the Invisible Elephant. I talked about the 3 culture model. Last month, we talked about national culture, how as a leader, things you need to take into consideration when you're leading people from different cultures and when you're navigating through times of uncertainty. Today, we want to talk about corporate culture, and next month, the webinar is going to be on personal culture or self-care. So, the grandfather of organizational culture is someone called Edgar Schein, who was from MIT in the United States, and this is one of his definitions as such. What's organizational culture? They're assumptions, they're shared beliefs held by people in the organization about the external environment, okay, what's happening outside, and their unconscious internal integration of how they respond. So in other words, it's a mental model, right? It's the way we think inside the organization. So if that's the case, what do we actually mean when we talk about remote teams? Okay, let me just bring that here. Whoopsie. Okay. Sorry for that. So here's a definition of a remote team. It's a group of people who are coming together to serve a common purpose. Sometimes referred to as a virtual team. The distinction we make between virtual and remote teams is in virtual teams, sometimes you work on a project and you may work in a matrix organizations. You have different reporting lines. You may have a hard line reporting to someone and a dotted line to somewhere else. Whereas in terms of, when we talk about remote teams, we tend to be coming together under one leader. And of course, remote teams are co-located. Therefore, we're not in the same office. We may be across town, across cities, across countries. We may be across cultures, and of course, across time zones. Just in this group itself, we have people right across time zones. We have people here who are dialing in from the United States, where it is in the evening, where it is Wednesday evening, 10 o'clock at night, and we have people who've dialed in from places like India, where of course it's a nice time for them, because the last time we had the webinar, they had to come in really early, and we have a couple of people who've come in from Europe as well. So this is the reality of what it means to work remotely across distance, culture, and time. So I'd like to ask you to do a quick question. Here, this is a quick poll. And here is the question for you. What is a key challenge for you in working with remote teams? What's a key challenge? And I'd like you to respond using the chat function. For those of you who are not familiar with Zoom, you'll be able to see either where the toolbar is, ability to type into the chat function. So can I get you to do that for a moment? I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll be able to see the chat. Okay, so Kat says, building relationships. You're always a challenge, right? When you can't actually see people. Catherine, accountability. How do you get traction on delivery? How do we performance manage? The incidental conversations, absolutely. The water cooler conversations, the conversations you get over coffee, being able to go out for lunch, etc. Yep, Travis. Yeah, concentrating on the webcam hour after hour. And haven't you noticed how tiring that gets? Do you ever find you come to the end of the day and go, God, why am I so tired when I haven't done much? A poor connection. Quinton, yes, absolutely. We sometimes have this assumption that we get traction and it's the same bandwidth all across the world when it's not. Especially when people are having to work from home. In many countries, of course, you have different speeds, different connection speeds, etc. Yep, absolutely. Not being able to have personal contact. Yeah. Sure thing, Tony. Getting people to pay more attention to you than the one physically closer to them. Yeah, sure thing. You know, how do we have that? The requirements from the manager. Oh, yes, indeed. That's a great one. So how do we actually have clarity around that? So in last month's webinar, we talked about high context, low context forms of communication, different styles of how people communicate. Scheduling, indeed. Fabulous. That's great. That's, you know, you can certainly see that quite a number of challenges that come up, right? How do I ensure I get connected? Oh, yes. How do we engage people who are introverts and are happy to take a back seat and not get involved? Indeed. How do we build rapport? Yeah. How do we read body language, for instance, right? I mean, that is so challenging, especially when you are on a little screen like this. How do you make sure you can actually read people's language? It's the little nuances, right? How do you get to know personalities, etc.? Thanks very much for that. So I'd like to pose this reflection question to you. What's the impact of these challenges for yourself, for your teams, and for your organization? Right? What's the impact? Just take a moment and just reflect on that while I get back to the presentation. And thank you, everyone, for that. So, here are some of the common challenges that comes when people work remotely or when they're working virtually in co-located teams. One is what we call the architecture of the firm. What do we mean by that? That's actually the structure of an organization. How are organizations laid out? Because in certain countries you have different layers, and it's not easy to replicate that architecture in every part of the world. So how do we kind of do that? Working in a matrix structure, for those of you who do that now, understand how challenging that can be. Boundary spanning is the term we use when we're actually working across cultures. How do we first build relationships, communicate well, build trust, gain rapport, and ensure we're aligned with people in different parts? How do we work across cultures, distance, and time? And the challenge of how do we maintain being local and global at the same time? So we're actually really trying to think about how do we work with all these various challenges around with us. And one of the things I'd like to share with you, just in terms of a framework of thinking, is this model called the Cynefin framework. And this is based on the work of David Snowden. And this is a useful model to think about it because it helps look at complexities in the environment. And it's pronounced Cynefin. It's a Welsh word. I'm not Welsh, but David Snowden is Welsh, and it's a Welsh word meaning all the variables in an environment. And let me just run through this very quickly for you. I'm going to start at 6 o'clock. So right down at the bottom where it says simple. So this is when you look at a cause and effect, really simple, right? There's something that goes wrong. What do we need to do with it? How do we fix it? So if you think of a production line, something goes wrong with the production line, let's fix that, and then we are back on track again. So organizations that follow best practice, we tend to look at that. Moving then counterclockwise to 3 o'clock, which is complicated. This is where things start looking, the environment, a number of things go wrong, and we start thinking about there could be a number of variables here. We may need some expertise to look at the same situation. So for instance, I may be driving in my car, I hear a noise in the car that something's wrong with the engine. Obviously, I'm not a mechanic. I need expertise. So this is the world where most consultants tend to live in. They bring in expertise because it's complicated. Moving then up across to 12 o'clock, where we move now into the world of complexity. So complexity occurs when there's multiple things happening in the environment, and it actually we don't really know how to make sense of it. We kind of go, well, and the key thing here is to ask questions because no one quite knows the answers. And you're starting to see a level of complexity in our current situation. If you look at how do birds, geese that fly in the air, in the V formation, that's a great example of complexity. And then finally, on 9 o'clock, it's chaotic, where things are just not making sense at all. And right now, I think we are in the chaotic sense of the world as a planet. We're trying to make things happen. One of the key things that we need to do when we're in the chaotic state is actually act, just be in action. And you try something, doesn't work, redo that, try again, try something else, and it's a frame of reference. And so what I find when I'm working with my clients is actually trying to establish where are the problems coming from, because many a time, if you're looking for a simple answer, give us a simple answer, problem, cause, effect, to a complex problem, it is definitely not going to be an easy find for that. So let me just then dive down into complexity and complicated. So as you can see here, this is, you remember for the days of when we used to fly an A380, a beautiful aeroplane. It is a very complicated piece of machinery. However, you find that people who are trained in it, if there's something wrong with it, will know how to fix it. Look at this, a shoal of fish or a school of fish. This is complexity. It gets really complex. How do we make sense of this? one of the things that we need to understand when we are working in remote teams, working in virtual teams, is people are complex. Working remotely has a high degree of complexity. So we want to try different things, but it doesn't mean that you can do one thing and it will always work. You may do one thing with one person, it may work, but it may not work with someone else. So let's go back then to understanding how is it then that it impacts people. How does complexity impact people? And I'm sure a lot of you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Psychology 101. Yeah. The base is what we call the physiological needs. So what is that? Maslow talks about the fact that the key things as human beings, do we have enough water? Do we have enough food? Do we have shelter? Do we have clean air to breathe? Next thing is safety. Is there safety in terms of my surrounds? Is there psychological safety for me? Is there physical safety for my family and for myself? Love and belonging, a sense of community, who am around, how do I actually feel about that? To the next level is my level of self-esteem, and finally around self-actualization. So if you think about where we are right now, okay, where we are right now, I would propose to you that most people are in the first two layers of the triangle. In other words, a whole bunch of people around thinking about, is my job secure? How long am I going to have my job? Am I going to be fired? How am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to pay my bills? What's happening for me? What's the future look like? What happens to all those plans I had that I wanted to do? What's going to happen now, etc. So when people are caught up in what we call the basics of survival, it becomes really difficult to actually look at how do I contribute to the organization's success? How do I actually engage more? So as people who work with others in remote teams, it's really important for us to take a moment to A, appreciate that, and B, address that. Last night, I was having an email conversation with a client who's part of a team I'm coaching. And he said to me, you know, Tom, when the lockdown started 3 weeks ago, I had these great plans. I was going to get fit. I was going to be healthy. I was going to take the opportunity to make sure I exercise regularly because I was going to be home, no commute and travel time, etc. But 3 weeks on, he said, I just cannot resist going to the fridge. You know, the level of food I'm consuming, I just can't believe I'm doing that. So here's a classic example, right? What we call cognitive dissonance, about somebody who, you know, I'm going to do this, but I get pulled into doing that. And these are some of the things that occur when people are working remotely, when they're working in their home office. I wrote yesterday in my newsletter about how to work from home based on a conversation I had with a friend of mine. And one of the things I talked about, one of the points was about getting dressed for work, for instance. And my wife is also now working from home. And she mentioned to me last week, we've been married now for 30 years. She said to me, oh, now I understand why you get dressed for work. Because for years she used to say to me, why do you get dressed for work when you're just working from home? Why do you need to do that? You know, it changes your mindset. So we need to appreciate that these are some of the things that people are going through. So hence, I want to share with you 4 pillars, 4 things that I think will help in building or leading cultures in remote teams. Firstly, when we get caught up in survival mode, we forget the purpose of our existence. So if you think of it from a workplace perspective, what is the purpose of why we exist? This is an existential question, right? Why does the organization exist? Why are we here? Who do we serve? Who are our customers? Who are our stakeholders? Why did we get created in the first place? Because in times of stress, which we are in now, this is when culture really starts to come into show. And for many organizations, it may be an opportunity to actually revisit their purpose. And actually, as leaders, it's important for us to remind our teams on a regular basis on what our purpose is. Those of you who may be familiar with Simon Sinek's work, he talks about the golden circles, and that is at the core of why we exist. So that, I think, is a really important part as leaders to be conscious of. The next thing is our values. I go one step of that. What is it that we stand for? So the values are the things in terms of what are the things that's important for us as an organization. So let me give you a couple of examples. If safety is an important value for you as an organization, then when you're working remotely, how does that play out for the team? For instance, do we actually take the time and the trouble to look at, so what is the safety precautions like in the current place of work? So if somebody is working in a bedroom or working on the dining table, things like in the office, you may have ergonomic chairs, you may have stand-up desks. These do not exist in the home. So what are some of the things that we need to put into place to ensure that they are keeping themselves physically safe, psychologically safe? If care is a value, as it is for one of my organizations, clients that I work with, how is it that we demonstrate care? What are some of the behaviors we can actually put in place to show that? Courage is another value. How do we, in this time when we're working remotely, demonstrate courage? How do we actually challenge each other? How do we hear, like that point that was brought up, how do we bring extroverts in? If we talk about one team, how do we enable that as a behavior when we are working remotely? Are questions, I think that's important for you to, again, as an organization, during these times, revisit what some of those values are. And again, ask the conversation, have the question around, does this actually make sense for us right now? Operating principles is what are the rules of the game? So I mentioned the Australian rules football here in Melbourne. If you go up north, the northern part of Australia, they play rugby, they call that football. You go into South America, Europe, football is soccer. You go to the United States, it's gridiron, and they're all called football. They all have different rules. So how do we play the game? So in a remote team, in the organization, what are the rules of the game? Just a couple of days ago, I was speaking to someone who has just moved to a new team. He's been there for a month. He has not had an onboarding process. Yet he has just hired someone into his team, and he's now expected to onboard this new individual. So again, you can see some of the things that's happening in this time of complexity. What are the rules of the game? How do we work here? How do we operate? And when someone is working remotely, when you're on your own and you're far away from the hub, it's very easy to go off tangent. Again, we need to keep ourselves reminded. We need to remind ourselves and others on how and what the rules of the game are. And finally, tools and tips. Gosh, there are so many tools available now, aren't there? I mean, who had heard of Zoom 2 years ago, for instance? But now we have everyone's using that. You have Google Hangouts, Skype, so many different types of tools that you can actually use. So it's one thing having the tools, but it's another thing about actually teaching people how to use them effectively. And again, as you can appreciate, e-learning modules are fantastic for getting information across. And when people are working remotely, when they are working virtually, how do we ensure, A, they have the access to the tools, but B, how do we actually ensure that they use these tools well? Okay, so that is what the 4 key pillars are. So here's what we're going to do next. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to put you into a breakout room, a couple of breakout rooms, right? And so your breakout rooms, you'll have an opportunity to meet and talk to a few people. I'm going to give you probably about, we're going to give maybe about 6 minutes or so for the breakout. I'd like you to think about, the question is, what are some of the insights you can apply to your remote teams? And again, the idea is to have a conversation so that you can learn from each other and discuss some of the things we've talked about here. We talked about complexity, we talked about Cynefin, we talked about Maslow's theory, we talked about 4 pillars, we talked about the fact how organizational culture is a mental model of how we look out at the world as a team. So take this opportunity to discuss with each other. And to do that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Hey, Tom, we're back.
We're back. Fantastic, Christopher. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I hope you had an opportunity to meet some people, network. You know, that's always important, isn't it? So I sent out in the broadcast, we're really interested to hear from perhaps some of the people who are in the groups who can give us a summary of the discussions you had. So perhaps you can just come off mute and use your microphone and speak to us.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in, Tom, in the absence of anyone else.
Okay,
I was in a room with Katrina, with Katrina, Tanya, and I don't recall the other person's name. I'm not sure if they dropped out at all. Probably the first thing we spoke about was the Cynefin framework, so excuse me if I didn't get the pronunciation correct, but just thought it was an interesting framework in which to consider things, particularly in the current state. So, you know, and I was saying about chaos around COVID and the unknowns and how quickly we're able to act and do things under those circumstances. We spoke a little bit about the, you know, future impact of this and what it might mean for, you know, accommodation and, you know, a resetting of you know, who we need in the office, who we don't, improve productivity, instead of moving between, you know, a number of different work locations, which we have. So that was probably most of the discussion. I don't know if the others want to add to that.
Great. Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.
Yes. The Cynefin framework is, I think, a useful framework because I think it looks at all the different variables. And especially when it comes to complexity and chaos, I think it's just a useful way of looking at it because, you know, it is right now, it is chaotic. And it's always interesting when you hear people who are saying, well, give us the answer. What are we going to do next? When is it going to stop? When are we out? Actually, nobody knows. We're just making it up as we go. But of course, sometimes people don't want to hear that because it's ambiguous, and there are people who like to have more assurance. And of course, in remote teams, how do you message those? Okay. Who else? Someone else? Can I invite someone else to come off mute?
Yeah. Tom, this is Sunita. I was in breakout room 3.
Yeah.
And so we discussed 4 takeaways as such. Hold on, I've just lost my my Word document where I noted. So the first one was actually the importance for us to reiterate the values of the company and to see how we can message to, let's say, to the new joinees. Yeah. hold on. Yes. So how do we demonstrate the key values of organization to in remote teams,
Yes.
especially when it comes to onboarding the new joinees and creating an employee experience that is far more difficult in the virtual atmosphere. So how does one get to make it three-dimensional? How do we engage everyone? So that
Yep.
was one reflection we had.
Yep.
The second one was on accountability and responsibility needs to be shared much more now.
Mm-hmm.
You know. And the third discussion was around the purpose. And one of the suggestions was to do it in a more egalitarian manner so that every team member articulates this. And this will also help people who are kind of off balance with new routines to focus on our purpose and to encourage transparent communication with regard to the kind of support that is required. And the last reflection was around how much this flexibility was a much dreamed of
Yes.
desire, but it actually, when it has come true, it is actually quite difficult because most of the routines have gone into disarray, have
Yes.
impacted. You know, not all of us can work without structure.
Yes. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sunita. That was very good. Very comprehensive. 4 points. If you just think about it, look at how you normally onboard somebody. When you're in the office, it's so incidental. It's like, oh, by the way, I forgot this, or I have this question to ask. I can just reach out and ask somebody. But when you're remote and you're on your own, you're much more hesitant to do that. So I think that's a really good point. I love the fact that I heard someone say the other day, I used to hate my commute time, which was an hour, but he said, I miss it so much now. I wish I could get it back. Thank you. Someone else.
I forgot my video, sorry. You heard my name. I was in room 11 with Catherine, Kathy and Emily, I think.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not very best with names. We didn't directly name it, but we sort of spoke about operating principles, really, because one of us mentioned who was relatively new in the team, and there seemed to be issues with connecting across the team. Her team, and what others do to achieve that. There was some lack of buy-in, I suppose, in video conferencing or participating.
Yep.
And how does one keep track of progress, I suppose, or achieving milestones. But cohesion we mostly spoke of, and others had, daily or very regular catch-ups.
Yep.
And allowing the space for social conversation on a regular basis. And using the different means, I guess, of the technology, so video, chats, keeping up with work, and the social means that seems to be able to retain a strong sense of cohesion across the team.
Yeah.
And whether it's many or little people. But I guess that was more of a one key issue or question that really raised it, which I thought was interesting. How does one get that buy-in of people that are resistant to, say, participate in the video, especially in this time of stress and change? As someone just said, the flexibility, we all longed it, and all of a sudden it's there, but some people don't really seem to like it. So how does that work?
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I love the point around how do we get buy-in on video. And I know we all think that video is much better, but sometimes for some people, actually video, they prefer without being on video. In fact, I was having a conversation with David Senior, who is actually in the group. He's a very experienced coach.